Stick around. School Connect will be ready in 5 minutes. Stick around. School Connect will be ready in 5 minutes.
And we're live.
Whoa.
Hello.
The magic of the live show.
Ooh. Wow,
Fancy.
fading transition. After our special guest this week, Eddie.
He's happy to join and help.
Yeah.
Our surrogate Alessandro for the week.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. We are down one this week because Ale is a very busy composer composing. He's working on a special project at the moment, so he couldn't join. But he'll be back next week, presumably.
Yeah,
So,
hope so.
So what are we
this
doing this week, guys?
we are doing an appraisal, and so we plan to kind of swap these in every few weeks. And what it is essentially just us reviewing each other's work. And this was, maybe Shane, maybe this was your idea, kind of initially with the stream.
Yeah, it was something that like Sam and I had chatted about because we had really good memories of when we were at RCM. You know, frequently we would just come in and listen to whatever track we'd been working on that week and get a discussion going. And it was like really useful, just down to earth feedback. We could kind of talk about anything about the music, and that action of sharing it with everyone and hearing everyone's thoughts in real time is like a really good catalyst for improving what you're doing.
I find as well, I mean, it's not just like a safe space in terms of constructive criticism, but it's also, as soon as there's someone else in the room, you listen to it with someone else's ears. You know, you hear it completely differently. So that in itself is useful. But yeah, it's important to have that, I think, safe space to listen to your music with someone who's going to be helpful to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Interestingly
yeah.
enough, I just was gonna say we this sort of share and tell thing is something that we started doing also in my year with my course mates in college, specifically with the people that were living together with me in the students hall. And for a couple of times we started getting together. Actually, it was very cool because it wasn't just screen composers; it was just composers in general, and we would like play each other some of our music and then comment and give each other feedback. And um, yeah, it's definitely, as you guys were saying, it's something very very useful, and I think one of the biggest ways in which we can grow from each other's feedbacks and comments.
Yeah.
For sure.
So today we're doing, as the titles give away, Sam and Vincenzo. So we're limiting it to kind of 2 of us at a time, just so we can actually have some space to talk about it, rather than trying to do all 6 of us in a week. So we're gonna kind of swap around every maybe 4 or 5 weeks or so. We're gonna do one of these. So I've got all of these ready, and why don't we start with Vincenzo? And why don't you let me know which one you'd like to play back first?
Well, why don't we start with the Seed Part 2, which is a track that I composed for a documentary that I did recently.
You know, this is the one I was going to pick.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I haven't heard any of these. None of us have heard any of these.
I've heard this one. I actually really like this one. This
Okay.
is very
Oh
good.
man, thank you.
That implies that you really didn't like the others, but anyway.
I just meant this one in particular was very good. I remember because we talked
This
about
is
it.
the one good track that I did in my life.
I surprisingly like this one. So,
Much like a seed, it grew on me.
Yeah. Oh, shall
There we go.
we listen to it?
Yeah, so the way we're going to do this is we're going to listen through, and then the composer can give some sort of context to it, and then we're going to sort of go into it and give just collective feedback. And, you know, this is a place where we don't have to hold anything back. So, not in a harsh way, but it just gives us a chance to, you know, obviously we respect each other's work, you know, so it gives us a chance to, you know, really be honest with each other.
Oh, Michael is getting like.
I'm just getting ready to take notes if I have anything, so I don't forget.
This is getting serious. Like, oh, okay, I should get ready for that too.
I'm actually dictating it down.
Cool.
Okay,
Let's
so The Seed, Part 2. Very nice.
Great.
Thank you.
Right.
So, thank you.
Nice one, man.
Bit of a shameless self plug. The track is, if anybody wants to re-listen to it and listen to the rest of the soundtrack for this documentary, it is on Spotify, and it's called Cookies, Tea, and Spices. Well, shall I just say a few quick words about this, and then we can maybe you can start burying me.
Thanks for joining, James. Got
Hi,
some
James.
good feedback already.
Well, the documentary is basically the story of three different people who are involved with the world of cooking and food in general, and um, it basically it's the story of you how these three people basically manage to keep their own identities and their own roots and their attachment to their roots alive after they went abroad and they built a career with what they do. So one is a woman who has a cookies shop in Paris. Then the other one is a person who has a tea house in Paris as well. It's mainly set in Paris. And the third one is a woman who does Thai cooking classes. She has an atelier and they do classes and stuff like that. And it's kind of like inspired by the food documentaries. I don't know if you guys have watched Chef's Table on Netflix. It's a very cool series.
Love it.
Kind of goes in that direction, but it's a bit more focused on not just the food, but also the individual stories of the people. And there were these shots. Maybe we'll get to hear another track later from this documentary, which is more related to like these very meditative moments of the documentaries where we talk about the stories of these people. But there are also these beautiful scenes which are quite often time lapses of food being made, and specifically this cue belongs to a scene where we are watching we're seeing the woman who does these cookies. She's walking us through sort of her process and her approach to do cookies, which is really interesting. I didn't imagine there could be so much depth and crafting to making a cookie, but actually the way they put the chips, the chocolate chips on top and the stuff, is like very well designed. It's meant to make it look perfect but not perfect. It's a whole interesting conversation. And then there's like this time lapse. So it basically needed to be a cue that was making this description, this voiceover interesting, and then could also accompany this time lapse quite well. And we decided to go for a sort of hybrid orchestral sound. As you may have heard, it's mainly orchestral stuff with some synths and pads. And I tried to draw inspiration from the music that I've heard on Chef's Table and these sort of documentaries. And I am a huge fan of minimalist orchestral music. And I wanted to do something which was all about textures and polyrhythms and this little sort of like bubbling soundscapes. That's it basically.
Can I ask a question quick, just
Yes.
on process? Did you, because sometimes documentaries like this are completely scored to picture, and sometimes the composers are commissioned to essentially create a library of music bespoke for the series that's then sort of music edited around. So how was this for you? Did you write all these cues to picture, or did you create a library?
Bit of both, as a matter of fact. I started writing the music quite early on. I think I started actually in May last year. And basically there was a bit of a hiatus during the summer where I basically, in the early stages, I composed a few tracks that I sent off to the director, and he had a very good cut of the documentary, but it still wasn't picture lock. He sort of re-edited the footage a little bit based on the tracks that I had sent him, and then he sent it back after the summer in September, when I actually did the main work for the soundtrack. So like basically when I started working on it in September, there were some scenes which were cut to my music and some scenes which were musicless and needed scoring, and those scenes I scored to picture. And this is one of those scenes, one of the scenes that I actually scored on the images. So yeah.
Cool.
Who would like to start us off?
Oh, can I start?
Go for it.
I just really like this track. I remember because as soon as it came out, I found it on iTunes and listened to it. It's really great. So I'll just go through. I did take some notes.
Thank you.
So yeah, when you said the seed, I didn't obviously know what was going on in the documentary behind. So what I imagine is literally just like a planted seed. And have you ever seen one of those time lapses of seeds growing where sort of things shoot out the top, it shakes a little bit in these offshoots? So that was sort of my frame of mind the entire time I was listening to this. Now, I really, really like the vibes at the beginning, and apologies for comparing you to somebody else, but I got some real Danny Elfman vibes, which I really like a lot. It's great.
Vibes.
Exactly, and it's nice because I felt like then you had like the strings, and then especially the flute accents, which poked out of the texture really, really nicely. And in my mind, this was sort of like these little offshoots of the seed growing up and up and up towards the ground. And the nice thing about the way it was constructed for me is that it all felt very organic. Like it all felt like it grew out of this one place. And it was nice as well because you had, the vibes mixed pretty heavily throughout, which was great because it was sort of grounding us in this original idea, and everything else was sort of just ornamenting on top of it. And it just felt very unified, which I really enjoyed. I liked it a lot. And it really fed into my image of this seed growing, even though that's not exactly what was happening. But I thought it was great in its construction, and it felt very natural.
Thank you.
Well, I think that it makes sense that it still made sense to you with that image, though. I mean, because there are a lot of similarities in, because when you say that, I think of nature documentaries, and there's a lot of similarities. If you have seen Chef's Table, which Vincenzo's talking about, of which I am an avid watcher because it's incredible, and I think has some of the best music, certainly for documentary, that there is. I mean, it's really well written, yeah. I mean, one thing. I mean, my thoughts on it. I thought that, it's essentially, it sounds like this kind of montagey sequence where there needs to be this pulse that keeps that motion going through and kind of drags us through whatever's happening on screen. But then with that comes this majestic and perhaps like magical feeling to sort of inspire wonder at the activity that you're seeing as well. And that you do that really well. And I think you do that through, as I say, the pulse, but also the harmonic language as well is really clever. It's not, it's not constantly, it's not broken and shifting, but it is kind of, it's just kind of in the same way the pulse is, it's just kind of pulling us through the whole time. And that's kind of classic for a montage sequence like this, where you need to be able to have that, that feeling. I think one thought I had, which is very difficult to comment on because I think there's a little bit of compression going on.
Yeah, there was definitely.
And so in terms of, I had a thought, because this is kind of not dissimilar from the styles that I write as well, at least at my default setting, and so my thinking was about the what you're communicating in terms of like intimacy in the sound, because like if with Chef's Table, for example, there's a very kind of, it's very clear and there's a lot of clarity to the sound, and it's very kind of it's got a chambery sound to it.
Yeah, it feels very intimate.
Yeah, and I think for me at least, that I think you could have pushed, like for instance, like perhaps I'll phrase it as a question instead. So what samples did you use for this? What orchestral samples?
Yes, orchestral samples. I think there's mainly Spitfire stuff, probably a bit of Berlin winds.
Cool. So
and
for
a lot of Omnisphere.
So for like the strings, are you using the chamber strings?
No, as a matter of fact, these were the symphonic strings.
Right, because that's like, that would be my immediate thought, is just double chamber strings on top of that, because you immediately get just a bit more. And it doesn't even have to be like, so you can really hear that. But what it does for me is the symphony gives you that outer ring, and then the chamber gives you like the inner ring, and suddenly you feel more part of the orchestra, and then subconsciously you're closer to the action, you're surrounded by people, and it gives you a kind of a relationship with the music a little bit more. And because I'm guessing that in this scene, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing there's room for music.
Yeah.
So you've got that space to push that a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I again, the compression was fudging that a little bit, so it's hard to tell. But that
Yeah,
would be my first thought.
I think also it sounded on my end, it sounded a little bit darker than my mix
Mm.
actually is. But this is a very interesting comment, and I was gonna say, as a matter of fact, I don't know if you guys do this, but a technique that I've recently learned over this past year, basically over the past 10 months, and that I've started applying sometimes, is to basically program the section's head, the section leader. So like I do my like violin ones with like symphonic strings, and then I sort of double at least the lines with a solo violin, which I put very very soft in the mix. But sometimes when you need a moment like what you're saying, Sam, when you feel more like the sort of the clarity of the individual player, if you just bring a little bit up the volume of the solo player, it's kind of like a programming escamotage that allows you to get a bit more clarity. I've never tried it with chamber strings. I should try that, but I think it's very useful sometimes. And actually, when I did this music, I still I wasn't familiar with this technique. So I didn't think of this, but surely what you're saying makes sense, and it could have used maybe a bit more of the sort of the clarity and the crispiness of the chamber, the intimate chamber sound.
You're so right, and I do that all the time. The way I discovered it was by cheating the act of kind of sweetening your demo, because that's a very common thing to do, is to sweeten it through recording by, for instance, a string section, you get a string quartet and then you mix it low,
Yeah.
but you get way more kind of air and realism, and I just thought, I can't necessarily afford to do that even, but my solo samples have much more expression and much more air and much more kind of bite if I'm doing shorter stuff, for example, than the ensemble. So I don't even like copy paste. If I'm playing in a legato line, that's when it really works, because I just select both tracks and hit record and play them at the same time. Like cello in particular works great to improve like the ensemble legato patch. But yeah, I think it's great to do that.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Sam and Vincenzo, on that technique, I think not copy pasting is a really important thing, because anything you can do to make it sound individualistic, even to the extent of perhaps not quantizing it or exaggerating like dynamics as compared to the other lines you have, I think that can really give you like a featured sound that, like you said, Vincenzo, you can then bring in and out when the moment calls for it.
Yeah, I usually treat it in terms of priority. So if it's like if it's an accompaniment, to keep it really simple texturally to explain it, if it's a simple accompaniment, then I quantize it to keep it unobtrusive. But if it's like an expressive line, or perhaps like layered spiccato or something, then I think it's important absolutely to not over quantize it.
Yeah, I'm generally not a huge fan of quantizing too much, and so I think especially in this track you can kind of hear it in some. I deliberately left it not quantized and a little bit imprecise.
I was actually going to mention about that, because I heard with the woodwinds there were some moments where I was like, oh, they're a little bit out of time.
Yeah,
I wasn't sure. Like,
no, it's deliberate. I just like, I really don't like to hear things which are super quantized, and when it sounds slightly inaccurate sometimes, I think it just adds this is just my personal feel. I just like it sounds more human to me.
I think it works particularly in the context of this track, where you have a lot of moments where you have a bit of like a blurred texture, like for example where you have those like kind of tremolo chords in the woodwinds, which is like one of my favorite sounds, by the way. I absolutely love that. And I had a couple things about that I was thinking, which is that when you had those woodwind patterns, it sounded to me like they kind of swelled in and out, but I felt like they could have like disappeared more on either end.
Oh, interesting.
It's a subtle thing, but I feel like that might have made it just like, I just love that feeling of suddenly hearing something and then it disappearing. For me, it was kind of like, in what I heard at least, it was like there and then it was gone, and I kind of noticed it being gone rather than it just disappearing like in the wind.
Like notationally from piano to piano rather than niente.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And you mean like also orchestrating the dynamics, like dropping players in and out.
Oh yeah, that could have achieved
Yeah.
that result as well. Although
Yeah.
I would be worried about doing that. It might feel like a bit of a mess if you don't do it very carefully. But yeah.
Hmm.
I
Well,
have some production feedback,
oh, yes, please.
in which I'm hosting the stream, so I'm hearing the true version of it,
Yeah. Please
uncompressed.
go ahead.
So to me, I think you could do a lot more with reverb, because it sounded like everything was coming from the same space. And it actually sounded like if I was to try and recreate this physically, that like the winds were kind of in the middle of the stage, then the percussion probably behind them, and then the strings like outside in the parking lot. They sounded like so far away to me.
Oh,
The-
really? So the strings sound, because like the percussion back and the wind midway in the stage was what I was going for, but the strings.
I mean,
Out-
I'm exaggerating, but I think the strings, to me, it sounded like it was almost because the string samples are typically like, if you kind of put everything on default settings, they're sort of designed to sit where an orchestra normally sits.
Mhm.
So with that, I think it's like a little bit more attention to how you're using the reverb to kind of control how close or far away they are. Because it kind of sounded like everything was in the same line. Like, and that the winds came forward a bit more, but I think that made it a bit blurry overall. Like, if there was more clarity in that, and I think particularly if the strings came forward a bit more in the mix, then you would have to do less work to kind of, get these other effects and textures that you've orchestrated.
That's very interesting.
I wonder if the chamber thing is a potential solution to that. Even just having naturally closer mic'd in samples, or even, I mean, I would sort of question the need for a symphonic string section anyway. But if you really wanted that size, then I would immediately put the close mic up. Do you keep just tree mic on full and
No,
then,
what I
or what do you
usually
do?
do is I keep the tree microphone almost up to the maximum, and then I depending on how I want strings to sound, I play with the closed mic. And so I have, like,
Right.
depending on the sort of sound that I'm going for, I'm using different setting of a different setting of the closed microphone.
Interesting, because I mean, my thought there is like, I mean, I think it could either be a production issue or a programming issue, in terms of where you're hearing the strings. Do you know what I mean? And I think my immediate reaction to that isn't like, not to say it's wrong, but like, why do there need to be that many players in
Yeah.
the string? Do you want that kind of intimate sound that's drawing people in, or do you want to really impress with the size of the ensemble? And in which case, if you need that big ensemble sound, then it's a production issue, and you need to make sure you're hearing enough closeness as well as
So
the size. You know what I mean?
so the thing with with having a full symphonic section comes from the fact that the whole first chunk of the documentary is like 8 minutes, something like that. It's a big cue, and I chopped it in three parts: the seed part one, the seed part two, and the seed part three for the album, sort of. But it's basically a continuous thing that has different chapters within, and the most of it needs is quite atmospheric and sort of underscore. It's mainly piano and strings, and I had initially actually tried, I think, with the smaller string section, but it sounded too small. I wanted it to be a bit more blurry and a bit more the way that the film is shot and the way the narration goes on. It's really sort of metaphoric and symbolic, I think. I'm very aware of my of words, since last time when I said mastodontic, which apparently is not a word in English.
You
It is
taught us,
now.
though. It is now.
It is now. Well, I mean, you know what a mastodon is. Well, anyway, let's not get sidetracked. So yeah, I needed a very blurry sound that a chamber orchestra wasn't giving me, and so I went for the symphonic strings. And I actually think I even EQ'd them in not in this track, but in some other tracks, just to make it a bit more really sort of.
I was going to suggest that actually, because I mean, I think like aside from like the meticulousness of choosing, chamber strings versus symphonic strings, I think you could make either clear. But I think it's just really in that clarity of like how reverb is used through all of the gain staging. So like are you using your close versus far mics or mid-range in the, contact instrument itself? And then how are you then busing it to reverb, and kind of are you using group, stems for that? So I think just like clarity of that to make sure that each of those gives you the kind of individual sound. And then I think it will take less work in the EQ. I mean, obviously I'm being nitpicky about it, but that's, the point of this. But that like it sounds great and everything is clear. Like you can hear what's going on in the orchestration. But I think that will really help it pop. And I think also that you can kind of play with the panning a bit as well too, because I heard some stuff, like a lot of the synth textures and stuff are coming through very clearly, like far left and right. But then a lot of the orchestral textures were kind of like mixed in the middle. And so I think a little bit more clarity to like, oh, was that, meant to be coming from the left side of the strings? And then are those the winds? Like I felt like in some places, this sort of like flutes and maybe clarinets were kind of up front and a little bit more blurry. And then all of a sudden I hear like staccato bassoon kind of like back in its chair. Yeah. Kind of where it should be.
How are you panning? Are you panning sort of traditional symphonic style, or are you doing it in a different way?
Yes, I am, but I am a bit careful, and I specifically the Spitfire winds, symphonic winds, I feel sometimes they are very well panned. Like there are some instruments, as Mike was saying, that you really hear them like on the far left, on the far right. Some other instruments or some other patches of the same instrument are not as well panned, I think. So every time I juggle a little bit to make it, and I think like I'm sort of starting to migrate towards Berlin winds recently, because I feel like they sound a bit better to me, even in terms of panning. But I was gonna say, it's interesting that you mentioned that with the synth textures, Mike, because whenever I have a synth texture or a synth pad, I always they often tend to sound unnatural to me and a bit dead, and I do my best to sort of try to open them up with there are a series of amazing plugins. I think like there's a really good one by Waves, which is called the S1 Imager, that you can really open things up, and with synths it works.
Yeah, there's an Ozone Imager is very good as well.
Exactly, iOzone Imager is very good. It has I think there's a couple of presets in that plugin which are just fantastic.
I literally just put it on because very briefly what I would do is, I think I mentioned like the other week actually, is I start with piano and then go sort of more and more detailed. So at some point I'm left with a ensemble patch that is then orchestrated, doubled on the individual sections, but I might just widen that ensemble patch a little bit to give the illusion of more space. So it's quite useful. I find it quite useful for that. But yeah, they're good little tools.
Anyway, I was gonna say that like watching the amazing streams that my friend Mike Ladisser does on Twitch, I've learned a great deal about panning individual instruments, which is something that I honestly, I'm just a bit lazy sometimes, and I just can't be bothered doing. But I've seen, Mike, that it's something that you pay a lot of attention to, and it really does make a difference. So I've started doing it a bit more and spending more time on it, just because, as I was saying, I feel sometimes libraries can be a bit uneven in the way they sound in terms of panning, even within the same instrument with different patches. So it's something that more and more I'm trying to pay attention to and to deal carefully with.
I think just sorry, Mike.
I was just gonna say, I think that like my mentality towards it is like, if you clean up the panning, you have less to do with the EQ. Yeah. Like, two things that kind of occupy the same sonic space. Like if you think of a rock album and you pan the guitar hard left and right, you're doubling it. they don't get in the way of each other. But if you put them both in the center, it's going to be a mess. So it's kind of like if you're doing something in your, in your first violins, it's kind of doubled in a synth, then throw that synth on the right side.
Yeah.
And it'll make it, you then don't have to compete with them.
I'm sure you covered this in one of your videos, Mike, but just on the panning thing, perhaps worth mentioning that there's kind of two schools of thought with orchestral panning, in terms of like traditional layout, or kind of from perhaps a mixing engineer's point of view,
Album recording.
which is so and they both, I think, have merit, but I it was a wrench, but I switched to the sort of mixing engineer's way of kind of being a bit more bass central, and then to avoid the feeling of too much passing to and fro from in the same frequency range. If you just keep the bass in the center and then higher to the outside, that seems to help that. I found an improvement, I mean, in my stuff.
Just because James has a question on that specifically, asking is there a standard panning for orchestra? I think, kind of, what we're maybe referring to is there's a sort of standard orchestral layout where you're looking at the strings, and it's more particular to the strings, where we have first, seconds, violas, cello, and bass behind the viola and cello. And so sometimes for album recording or even in concerts, you'll see this. They'll have the bass section is just in a row in the back of the strings, kind of occupying the middle. And then you'll put the violins antiphonally. So first in their typical position, seconds where the cellos would be. And then you throw the cellos where the seconds would be, and could keep the violas where they are, or kind of swap the cello and viola to opposite sides. And it's just, kind of the thought process behind it is you're just spreading the frequencies out. So you have your highs kind of on the outside, and then you move to your lows in the middle. And, so it kind of just asking, is it, do you do it by ear for each project? They give different effects, essentially, so it's kind of like it depends on what you're after. You could listen to, John Powell, and you could listen to John Williams and listen to how different their orchestral, arguably orchestral writing is very similar between a few different pieces, but Michael shakes his head.
No, I'm just immediately thinking of everything else. Sorry,
I'm speaking in a broad, classical sense, like it's properly orchestrated, romantic music, but the album recording sounds completely different, and so I think, is maybe a good sort of rule of thumb. Just try to listen carefully to those things and try to pick out the differences, and then go on YouTube and watch different conductors conducting different pieces in concert, and you might see different layouts, and then if you can then pay attention to kind of how that sounds.
You see a lot of different layouts with brass as well, though. Brass in particular, the position of the trombones and horns as well, because some people like to have them along the back row, some people like to have them on the left, and some people like to have all the brass just sitting on the right, and that's a very interesting to pay attention to as well. I don't know if there's one sort of preferred option over the other. I think John Williams tends to keep the horns on the left for clarity's sake.
Yeah, his I think is typically pretty standard.
I think just on the Johns comparison, you can, if you listen to soundtracks by each of them, I love the John Williams ethos, which is that very occasionally you'll hear a page turn in the soundtrack album, and who cares, it's incredible. But for just the best sounding orchestral music, I think John Powell's soundtracks all just sound great.
They're
and you can learn a lot.
recorded and hyper produced. Like it's
Sure.
It's you can, and luckily there's so many resources where you can see behind the scenes videos of exactly how it's laid out in Abbey Road 1.
Yeah.
And from different sessions. Go on his Instagram and it's kind of all there.
Yeah.
Cool.
So why don't we have another quick listen through of that, and then no further comments, and then we'll move on to one of Sam's pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Great piece, man. Well done.
Really great.
Thank you, guys.
Well done. Sam, what should we listen to?
Whatever. Pick one.
Cool, I'm going in the middle. So, TV period drama,
Work
an
in
urgent
progress.
letter, V1, demo,
Okay.
all
cool.
caps.
File name convention. Important.
Oh, very nice.
Bravo.
Well, that was an interesting listening experience.
How did that feel for you, listening back among us and our million viewers?
Mildly uncomfortable. But then it's a work in progress. So this is from an ill-fated lockdown started library album, sort of entirely hypothetical, with sort of imposed brief, which was to write something for romantic TV drama, Downton Abbey style kind of thing. And yeah, but I chose this one because it's very much a work in progress, and so there's plenty to talk about. It's what kind of stage is it at? So it's kind of it's at the point where I've got past ensemble patches, and I'm just kind of started putting them into, like, orchestrating it into more detailed instrument patches, all the while questioning the structure, the musical content in general. But essentially it's not in a style I'm, all about, and it's designed in a library album style with very particular edit points and that kind of thing. So yeah, go.
I really liked it. I thought you personally sort of nailed the Downton Abbey style, especially the modulating back and forth between the 6/8 and 3/4 feel and the piano rhythm. Really good stuff. Out of curiosity, just because there is so much sort of compression over here, how is the piano mixed in relation to the strings in terms of amount of reverb? It just felt very upfront, just because I couldn't really hear the reverb tail at all.
Yeah.
That might be one for Mike, because I can't remember how it's.
I was just sort of curious.
I just have another I think the piano sounds like appropriately up front.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
It is clear.
my just to compare, my immediate thought was the piano feels too strong for a lot of it. So
Yeah.
I think, and I feel, I hope I would have noticed that at the time, because I usually mix as I go along. So I'm like, yeah, it felt certainly stronger than I was used
Well,
to. Put it that way.
for me, my first comment and the main thing that I kind of like heard listening back to that was the piano. And yeah, I don't think it's necessarily to do with like overall loudness. I think it's more to do with like the fact that the piano sounds like a MIDI piano rather than a performance.
Right.
Like to me, that's like the main thing right now, which is that there's where you have the da 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 da. That's like it feels like it's all kind of the same or very
Yeah.
similar velocity, and it's all like super quantized. It just feels a little bit robotic, and that combined with the fact that I think it's for my taste, not saying this is objectively right, but it's like one velocity band too high in
Yeah.
that moment. It's
Mm.
like it's really hitting hard, and it's like it doesn't feel justified to me.
Yeah.
So
I
I think
think
it's like the piano, like making a MIDI piano sound real is so difficult, but I think that's like the one thing that would take this to like the next level.
What piano is that, Sam?
it's the Fazioli from Ivory 2,
Mm.
which I like a lot because it's softer than the Steinway and the like Bosendorfer ones that they have, which I find a bit
Up front.
too up front. But having said that, I think what my reaction to what Shane said there is what I'll have done is I'll have played it in, and because I've actually wanted a bit more brilliance to it, I'll have hit it too hard. And so, I mean, that's the kind of thing that I would hope to catch, like shortly, after the stage it's at now, to try and fudge the velocity versus level, yeah, to get that right.
Yeah, to
Sorry,
be
I
honest,
think
for me, sorry, Shane, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think velocity and also just like note on. To me, it's in order for it to feel real, it's got to have a bit more of, not
Yeah.
all together. So.
And I think what I've done is because I knew I was gonna. So I started with a piano sketch. So it has, yeah. So essentially, it starts off with the reduction and then orchestrate from that. And so I'll have played it in, but because I'm not a good enough pianist, I'll have done a lot of kind of normalizing is perhaps the wrong word, but making it very kind of easy to then orchestrate from. But then I have to go back and sort that, don't I? I think I'd done a little bit, but like very subtly on a couple of chords. And I think you're right. I think it needs a little bit more spread.
I think
It's sorry.
I think that it was mainly noticeable in the sections where like the beginning and the end where there was less going on and the piano was more exposed, like in the bit in the middle where you had like sort of full orchestra playing or like full band playing. I felt, and this is something obviously that happens, the more instruments you have, the fuller the sound gets, and the more you can cheat the listener, obviously. So it didn't bother me that much in the middle. But I think, yeah, definitely it was a bit more exposed. It was a bit more exposed when it was exposed. Do you
Yeah,
get
no,
what
I
I
do,
mean?
because I think that's yeah, it's texturally, it's kind of takes more of a back seat in the middle, doesn't it? But when it's
Mhm.
soloistic, it needs to be played soloistically.
Yeah.
Um,
I was going to say is that, I mean, part of this, again, may be the compression, but to me, it sounded like the actual tone quality of the piano was a little bit duller than it would be. I mean, to be
Yeah.
fair, like sampling a piano is really hard just because the interactions of notes against other notes is different depending on what chord, obviously, you play. And when they sort of sample it, it's sort of overall normalized. So it feels a little bit more manufactured when you play it. So for me, I think that if there was some way to slightly brighten up the piano, you could, like Shane said, take back the dynamics a little bit, or maybe even add something like an exciter on top of it and add those extra harmonics that seem to get cut off with any of the piano samples just to give it that more realistic feel.
well, I might even change the sample, to be honest, because it is quite a non-brilliant piano sample. So and the Ivory 2 library is really good, I think. And it certainly has much brighter options, which
Mhm.
it might be easier to lessen the brightness on.
I think the tone
on
quality
classical song.
will fit with the strings a little bit better if it's a little bit brighter. I think personally.
It may be better suited to the style as well.
Yeah.
This is probably a much later stage thing, but I also feel like you could do some real tempo map movement throughout this.
Yeah.
Like just
Yeah.
before you get, I have it up here and I'm kind of listening to it and thinking of more things to say, but just before it kind of gets to the large section where it's just before that, if you had like a RAL or something like that, could be really, really nice. And in the more soloistic sections have a bit more of a rubato feel. I think that would also take it, you know.
That's certainly something that it was actually against my instinct not to do. I'm normally all over that, but I never know with library stuff. I'm a bit I'm less
point,
experienced in that, so I'm not so sure how much of that you can get away with.
I was going to give some comments on that structure-wise. That and was also, you know, I was thinking that actually of kind of, because I feel like you have a little bit of that already, and was gonna suggest maybe like, unless it's I think what Shane is suggesting, like if it's at a particular section and it's really clear and convincing, you might be able to get away with it. But I feel like the feedback you'd get is this is going to be annoying to a music editor. And I think structurally overall, I think there's two library tracks within this. Like, I think that it's a beautiful piece of music, but that what I've had in the past is kind of like too many ideas, where it's like, if you imagine the music editor scrolling through, you know, hundreds of tracks trying to find something, they want a sound and they want it to be consistent. You know, they want to be able to be like, this is that thing, rather than kind of like, oh, well, it gets really chambery halfway through, is they're never going to get to that and see it. And so I think like you could make that a chamber piece on its own, where it's a lot more light and delicate, and make that the focus of it. And then with that too, I think structurally, kind of making these sections a little more clearly defined. So, which is, again, it's sort of like, I don't think of it as like necessarily dumbing down, but it's a hard thing of like anti-writing. Like, you can't write too much and put too many ideas into this, because it becomes confusing and it becomes harder to work with. So it's like, if you're shifting key and if you're shifting your kind of harmony too much, then it's sort of like, how can I, you know, if I need to grab 15 seconds of this, you're making my job really hard. So I think that's kind of what is difficult about writing library music, is like, you know, they love 8-bar phrases and things that fit neatly into a box and has a clear ending and doesn't really tie over from one section to the other. Like, I think you've got that in a few spots that are, like you mentioned, sort of editable points. And I think that's, you know, very important to have. So I think a maybe more clearly defined structure of, you know, like, this is sort of my A, that's my B, this is my reprise.
You see, this is interesting, because I get what you're saying, Mike, but I was on the other hand, I was gonna say that what really struck me about this this piece is, like, I think it's compositionally it's very interesting and well developed, and I think you can really say that you sketched something out and then orchestrated it, because there's a clarity, I think, in the way you orchestrated it, and the way the elements combine together, and from a compositional point of view,
there's a fluidity to it.
Yeah, there's a great
completely.
fluidity, which
I agree that it's a beautiful piece, absolutely. I'm giving those comments completely in the context of it being library music.
Yeah, exactly. This is what I was
about to say. Like, this, if you were to put out an instrumental album, I think this would be perfect. If you were going to write music in this style, I can understand both your points.
I mean, it's interesting that you both say, because if I was writing this in entirely my own style, which isn't this, then I'd be accused of the opposite, which is a lack of clarity in the structure, because I do tend to noodle. And so because of as I say, these kind of self-imposed library style imposed formula of structure, that's what I was trying to adhere to. And as a result, like for instance, the main kind of chordal theme, dum 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 dum, I didn't develop that nearly as much as I would normally if I was just writing for myself. It kind of, and so for me, from compositionally speaking, I feel like I want something else to happen. But as Mike says, in library, it needs to speak absolutely purely the identity of the track all the way through, and it needs to be that thing, and that's the thing that the editor is choosing. And so I found it therefore both simple and tricky in a way to do, because I'm sort of checking myself the whole time not to do too much. But I think
I find you like, when you're commissioned to write like part of an album, it's like you're not only trying to adhere within the tracks that you write, but you're trying to also kind of like, for lack of a better term, like water them down, but kind of like, make them consistent with a bunch of other tracks you've never heard. So that's kind of like the producer's job, and then the feedback that you get is sort of like, well, like this instrumentation here goes a little too far outside of the box for us here and there. And so it's sort of like that, it's that producer's job to make sure that everything makes a coherent album. And I think then it's like also from their point of view, what's easy is when a track just is what it is. Just does what it says on the tin.
And I think just to add to what you were saying about kind of emphasizing the edit points, perhaps, or making them as clear as possible, I think that's something that definitely, as you build the orchestration, as you would on paper or in notation software, that's something that you see the purpose of that point vertically, and so you emphasize it. And so that's the kind of, for me, would be a next stage, is as you add instruments, or as you double with the more specific instruments, you start adding a bit more at those points. So that would kind of be my intention, I think, to do that, to make it really obvious what the editor should do with it. Chop
Should
it
we
here.
have another listen through?
Just before we do, I was just gonna say, good stuff, Sam, on the solo instrument programming. Like, I think they sound really good.
Was that the Warren solo violin Spitfire one?
It is solo Spitfire, but I'm not sure that one is Warren, actually.
Sacconi?
Warren did Sacconi, didn't he?
Did he?
I think, or like the first edition of solos. I'm not certain that it's it, but I mean,
The like Artisan series.
Yeah, this is the latest solo strings, which have like
we're speaking about Warren Zielinski, by the way, who's like one of the first
Artisan.
call section leaders and sort of concert masters for London, and was the concert master for both Michael's musical and my album.
I was just going to say about the programming. I wonder, do you have a way of changing the amount of vibrato? Can you program that?
Although I find
thing that you could maybe give a little bit more expressiveness with. Like I find there's that really nice thing that players often do, where they'll like hit a note like straight and then introduce a little bit of vibrato gradually over time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And unfortunately, that's something I struggle with in that patch, because I find the transition of vibrato very clunky.
It's very okay.
And there's not enough subtlety in the transition, and so it's either on or off. And so usually I leave it on unless it's doubling something.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sam. It's very annoying because most of the solo string patches that I found are literally, they have the sort of the modulation control for the vibrato, but it goes nothing or medium high without a bit of a middle ground,
which is a shame, because everything else about it I love, because I think that it does it's very easy to do quite a natural portamento and stuff.
But I was gonna say, as Shane was saying, it's something that I wanted to point out too, and I forgot. Like, especially when quite early on, there's like that solo violin line, I think, that comes in. It's very well programmed, and I think having like a nice sounding programmed solo violin, it's not an easy thing.
Do you want a trick? If you have, well, if any of you have the Spitfire solo strings that includes their virtuosic first desk and progressive, I think the third one is. Don't use the virtuosic one. Use the first desk, which sounds counterintuitive because it's designed to blend, but actually it's much easier to use as a solo instrument, I find. Just saying. But they sound great, basically. I just think they sound great.
Or you can just hire Kate.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, or just get a player. Like Shane's saying, like it's hard to program the vibrato. That's where you cannot beat a player. I mean, it's just that simple.
And practically just on that, like you would, if you're pitching, well, say you're commissioned to do an album or to do part of an album for library music, then like you would never be the one recording because you're going to kind of go back and forth, and then sometimes like they'll accept your track and then they might record stuff. They might just hire an orchestrator and get it transcribed and record on their own without you even knowing, and then the album comes out, it's like, oh, they got a band, and so it's something that the kind of producer and the library will just sort of manage. Cool. Shall we listen through, and then I suggest we do sort of like a rapid fire round.
Sure.
For another.
While you listen, I'm going to take a quick restroom break.
Yeah. So we can do the next one. We can kind of keep it mostly just to criticisms. We can. I feel I'm playing a little bit of bad cop today, but it's all lovely. We all know. So let's have another listen through.
I'm immediately muting the last couple of those at the end, by the way. It's too many of them.
Very
But
nice.
seriously cool track, man. Very, very cool.
Yeah.
Vincenzo, what should we listen to next?
For the lightning round,
Yeah.
let's go with the sleepover.
Okay.
Ooh.
Been a while since we had one of those, V.
Yeah. I thought this last section was appropriate considering the time.
Very nice.
Well done, man.
Cool. So we're sticking. Very well done. It's beautiful.
Yes.
So now we're sticking mostly to
Yes,
just
criticism.
quick criticisms.
All right. Well, first of all, there was a nice solo bassoon in there. What's the deal? Come on. Anyway, I would have done that for you.
It was quarantine time. It was lockdown time. Otherwise,
that's all right. That's what the remote setup's for. I do have to say real quick that I really just love the fact that you actually use bass drum as an accent point and used it very well. It was very well utilized. That's immediately the first thing that struck out to me.
But say something constructively critic.
I will once everybody else goes, because I have to think about it again.
My first thing is that kind of only thing. It's mostly a mastering thing. But I'd say again, kind of with the reverb, I think you could give a little bit more depth to the sound. So it sounds to me like the whole piece overall is clearly very well orchestrated, very well written, but it's sort of boxed in. So it's kind of like, if you give a little bit more depth, like send the percussion a little further back, bring the strings a little closer to you, and then widen it out. I think the whole stereo image of it sounded fairly narrow. So I think, just like, and then it'll give a lot more clarity to everything.
Yeah. Have I heard this before, V?
I think I sent this to you guys when I finished the series.
Okay.
This is for an animation series that I did in May, and it's the one that I sent you guys for feedback.
Again, really well written. My thoughts were snare drum, a couple of flams in there just to make it sound like a person playing it. It just felt a little bit robotic, and just make it a little bit messier. And the other thing was, the reason I asked if I'd heard it before is because I remember having the same thought, particularly with tuned percussion or wooden things
being very close.
It feels really dry to me. I don't know. I tend to prefer it to sound natural and at the back of the orchestra, and I know why it's close, because you want that clarity and you want that kind of
specifically for this one. I think when I send this to you guys, this is something that you told me actually, and I think we had a conversation about this. It's kind of like the sound of this thing is with percussion really in your face, because it's like the most playful thing I've ever written. It's for animation. It's all over the place. So I really wanted that sound with like tuned and also untuned percussion, like here. But yeah, no, it makes sense what you're saying.
I think it's just because of the woods. I think when there's no ring, it's very obvious if it's dry, and so I think just giving it a little bit more warmth in the reverb would help it being more in place. That was my only thought in that regard. But yeah, great.
Shaney Boo.
Sorry, just listening back to it. Yeah, really good. It's tough for me to find something critical to say, because I was going to say, like, the woodwinds are dry the percussion is dry and too close compared to the woodwinds, which are quite wet and far away. But like, if that's part of the color, that's part of the aesthetic, then I can't really criticize it for that. Yeah, sorry, I got nothing at the moment.
Yeah, I mean,
Michael, save me.
It's very like.
Oh, sorry, I was listening back as well. So.
It is that cartoon sound, isn't it? It's that kind of almost like percussion Foley kind of way of doing things, where everything's kind of sound effects in close, and so it makes sense.
I think particularly the percussion, the way I use the percussions for this whole score is they are the thing that's Mickey Mousing the most. So when something happens on screen, I quite often accentuated it with percussion more than anything else. This is why they're kind of the protagonist of the whole score. And also the producers told me that they want the whole score to feel really sort of like something that you could play, like something that kids could play at home. This was literally the brief for the opening credits that I had to write. Use as many toy instruments as you can. It needs to feel like something that you could play at home as a kid with like pots and pans and whatever you find in your house. Michael, did you want to say something?
Oh, and I was just listening back. The only thing that sort of sticks out to me is there seemed like there's some odd instrument panning choices. Somebody might have already said it as I was listening back to it. Just the now I can actually hear it from the source in my headphones.
Yeah.
I would just say, because there were a lot of things like the oboe and bassoon felt really far right when in fact they should be a little bit more center. And I think that especially if you're trying to have those woodwinds be up in your face, having them be sort of in the center of the sound would benefit it a lot. And it just sounds more logical to me. Maybe I'm too locked into the traditional layout of an orchestra, and maybe you're doing it for mixing purposes, but I think it just felt off kilter to me. Yeah, it felt shifted. I felt like I was leaning to the right just a little bit more. It felt heavier on that side. So that's what I would just say is maybe, as Mike said, widen it out a little bit and maybe just balance it out a little bit better.
Cool.
I did think of one small thing, just on the percussion note. It's hard to say this in the abstract, but I did feel like sometimes you're using like snare rolls and like tambourine rolls, specifically the sound of a roll, just to fill time. It felt a little bit like they were slightly too long for me. I don't know how that strikes you. It kind of felt like, oh, we're doing a roll again, and we're doing another roll, and we're doing another roll.
There's a lot of rolls indeed.
Yeah, where I wonder if there might have been another little solution, or actually sometimes just leaving a little bit of a gap more. I mean, it's difficult if you're doing something animation for kids and you want it to be really vibrant and colorful, but sometimes you could have taken a bit of a less is more approach. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Just try, because it feels a little bit relentless sometimes. It's like we're going, and then there's a roll, and then we're going, and then there's a roll, and then I'm like, I don't know.
No, it makes sense. I think that there's a lot of the music that I wrote for this series is like that, just because like, there's a lot of scenes where they're like this. It's about like a little wolf who's the protagonist and his friend, and they're like sneaking around and doing things, and it's really like kids being mischievous and kind of was trying to go in further. But when I re-listened to it a few weeks ago, after I'd done it and wrapped it up for a good month, I thought, my God, there's a lot of things going on in this. Like, it's really intense. And without the images, like, with the images in front of you, it sort of like it balances itself. But without the images, you listen and it's like, whoa, what is going on here? It washes you away.
With the image, it's like, pineapple and pizza. And then they just...
Okay, I'm gonna disconnect now. Bye, guys. It's been nice. Shall we go with Sam's?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to have another quick listen through? Because these are short anyway.
Yeah, go on. Let's listen.
Let's have another. I think it's just then helpful because we can kind of get the, kind of then re-listen based on all those comments.
Yeah, on the comments. Yeah, definitely.
Bravo.
Very nice.
Just,
I love a good flexatone.
Yeah. I
seeing a quick comment from Laura Frank. So saying, do you guys print stereo file with your music and master it?
Yes.
So I would say, at least for me, no. I think the mastering, I kind of do it by mixing. And maybe this is just me, but so kind of like what I print should ideally be the master demo. And also out of the way that I work and how my template's set up, which is kind of keeping in mind the idea of bouncing stems and things like that and ease of that for workflow, I avoid having like a bunch of mastering plugins on my. I don't have anything on the master output. So I'll kind of do that, and I do that through a convoluted way. Um, but so to me, it's sort of like master, kind of getting it in the mix. But what you're also referencing there is sort of like, do you throw a reference track in the DAW and kind of compare it? Absolutely, I think that's a great approach. So kind of take a track, that's similar to what you're trying to emulate. Look at it like with the Waves PAS analyzer or something like that, and you can see the frequencies and you can see the stereo spread, and then you understand like, oh, that's more or less what mine should look like too.
I always do two separate sessions. Like I have my template, my project where I compose, I orchestrate, and I mix in that. But then I like to keep things separate just because it gives me more clarity. And also, especially in a work like this one that we listen to, it's like a series with many cues. I just compose each cue and I mix each cues and then I export everything so that when I do the master session, I import everything in the same project. And first of all, it's just like a complete different set of plugins and a complete different set of things that you do when you're mixing and when you're mastering. When you're mixing, you're trying to balance each individual element and to make it sound like a whole organic thing. When you're mastering, it's just about really making it big, loud, spread in terms of EQ, in terms of frequencies, in terms of stereo image. So I like it's like a different set of plugins, and I just like to keep things separate. And as Lara or
Lara.
Lara, as Lara was asking, I have quite often a big master session with all the cues, and so I see multiple tracks, and that helps me balancing in terms of levels and loudness of like the final output that I try to have.
Just to mediate that conversation a little bit, I think the question is, what is mastering for? Mastering is conforming across different audio files for the purposes of a listening experience. So I think what Mike is talking about is preparing something. Well, there's two sides to this. Are you preparing something for approval, in which case what you need is for it to be loud enough for them to dub, or for you to dub to a picture so they can then approve it? Or are you talking about final delivery? Now that's a different thing. It's not the same thing as a demo, and I think I kind of do both. Like if I'm doing the preparing a demo for approval, then I've done the hard work. I mix as I go along, and I essentially just need to make sure that it's loud enough to be useful to check, basically to check that it's what they want. But if I'm at the end of a project, there's no money for someone else to do the mastering for me, then I get a separate project exactly like you with all the relevant plugins in it. I often, put same audio file on a track I know will have similar settings, cheats
Yeah.
and do it that way. But that's how I bounce the sort of, this is my final thing, to be dubbed.
Yeah, that's what
I think it's good to. Thanks for clarifying that, because I'm thinking towards like delivery for a film. I'm never mastering what's going to be dubbed, because that's really what's happening at the dub. So, like if I'm balancing all the levels between tracks, doesn't matter, because, they're going to be shifted and readjusted and probably adjusted with stems. So it's kind of getting mixed in the dubbing mix. So like typically for a film, you're not delivering mastered, you're delivering mixed files, not mastered files. If you're doing it for a soundtrack album, that's a different thing. And then the goal is to get all of these tracks to sound consistent with a similar stereo spread and a similar loudness so that they are cohesive on an album.
And it's perhaps worth mentioning the importance of that as well. If you have the opportunity to have another person to collaborate with the final product, if it is in on the film, then you really want someone objective that's hearing everything together and is able to assess how it's going to work in a dub and therefore how your music should be mastered. But if it's a different stage, then obviously we want someone to mix our music, but if it's demo stage, then you should be mixing, and that should be enough, really, I think. To
Well,
get
and even
approval.
if you're working with a mixing engineer, it would go from the mixing engineer to the dub stage.
Yeah.
So there isn't like a mastering engineer in between film, because it would be, especially if it's delivered in stems, it's going to be totally readjusted anyway.
But I think just to sort of simply answer the original question, which is, do you master from a stereo file? Which I think that was the question, and I think that is essentially
Yes.
the how it should be. You know, the mix has happened with stems, and the master is an overall listening experience. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember a masterclass with one of the mastering engineers from Abbey Road, and he was saying that, like, if people come in with a bunch of stems and they want a bunch of adjustments, he's like, you know, your money is better spent going back to the mixing engineer instead of spending it with me, and then get happy with your mix, come back and I'll master the thing. Because mastering for a whole album can take half a day, or could take a day. Because it's really like, that's kind of what they're doing, the final tweaks to make it cohesive.
Yeah.
Cool. Sam, what should we listen to? Good question, Lara.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Lara. Stick the film on, Mike. I just won't talk about it.
Here we go.
It's quite quiet at the start, sorry. I should have mastered it. So slow.
Nice, very nice.
Bravo.
So yeah, to briefly explain, I won't say too much because it's the project is a work in progress. But this is a last cue of film virtually copy pasted from a previous cue, but slightly changed. Very, very crap saxophone sample at beginning, which will be me at some point. But I thought so. This is sent and approved basically, and luckily the filmmakers know enough about music to know, for example, that saxophone is going to be much better than it is now. Yeah, I mean, that listening to that now is a very different experience again to what I was expecting. So it's hard to talk about much really, but yeah, it's essentially it's a kind of somewhat climactic thing. And the original cue, there's a lot of source music going on and a lot of knitting to do musically. So the end is designed to fade into source music, also in A minor. Yeah, so that's it.
Only thing for me really, I think the programming in the kind of chamber stuff sounds really good. I'd say, so my comment isn't about that, but that the orchestration as it builds, I think it kind of reveals itself a little bit too bare. Like it feels like I can see the steps of the ramp, if that makes sense. Where I think you might be able to kind of like bring those entrances in a little more subtly, to give the overall effect. Because like where you build to is great, but I think it kind of like draws a lot of attention each time there's something new that's kind of introduced. And I mean, maybe that's the sort of intention, and maybe it works better with picture. But to me, it seemed like you're going for this overall effect of it kind of growing, and then you're sort of adding and shifting the rhythm a little bit here and there, and kind of picking it out with more like individual voices coming to, you know, one big texture as a group. And I think just kind of sneaking those in a little bit more, and making them a little bit more subtle, so that we kind of like realize they're there after they've already started.
Yeah, I think there's certainly that applies to some of the layers. There are some that I want to be present, but I think you're absolutely right. There's others that are in the way. There's a solo violin in that I discovered the other day that I'd you know, you accidentally mute stuff in the programming. I was like, I want to hear that, and the other cue that it's copied from has already been approved. So I'm like, oh, can I put it back in the other one? But yeah, as an example of something that perhaps is better muted because it's probably getting in the way. But yeah, so I mean, it's obviously it's just a that's exactly right. It needs to have that build to a kind of feeling of everything being one monster at the end, but they've kind of struggled to get there a little bit. But there are certain thematic motifs that do need to be heard distinctly. So like those are the ones that I'll keep as they are. But yeah.
To me, the thing that stood out was the pizzicatos. I think they can be improved a little bit.
In terms of sound or volume,
they seemed a bit flat to me. A bit all like even and very like you could tell that they were programmed pizzicatos, sampled pizzicatos.
Okay.
And I don't know if it has to do with what you doubled them with or how you mix them or what it is, but like I am personally, I am very, very picky with the pizzicatos because I feel like they are the crappiest thing to deal with when you're doing program strings. It's like when you hear real pizzicatos and then when you hear them programmed, they never, ever sound the same. It's like so annoying to get them right and crispy, and most of the times libraries are also too tight. It's just like pop, all together. Well, if you hear pizzicatos played by an orchestra, it's always a bit of, you know, it's very difficult to get it super tight. And I think the tightness of it was the thing that was sort of.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting one because I'm pretty picky with my pizzicatos as well.
Do you only use one patch? Sorry if I ask.
No, it's all orchestrated.
No, but I mean, do you only have one pizzicato patch? Because what I usually like to do is to have at least two different libraries doing pizzicatos at the same time, because to me it gives it a bit more flavor and a bit more.
Well, no, I don't have. I've got an ensemble patch and then I've orchestrated it onto the separate instruments, and I'll have turned up the separate instruments to close mic as well as tree mic so that you can hear a bit. I mean, not that I'm trying to make excuses, but they sounded about 10 times louder than certainly at the start. It obviously builds, but it felt really heavily compressed, which doesn't help pizzicati that much if it's that. But I know what you mean. They are definitely quantized, and they're actually doubled with a
vibraphone.
Yeah, vibraphone marimba something.
It's a vibraphone.
It was a vibraphone without the pedal pushed down, right?
Indeed. And
All right.
I'm second guessing that a little bit.
I actually kind of like that texture. I was going to say that I actually really like that sound. I was going to actually, similar to Vincenzo, I do think that the pitches are aligned a little bit too much. I was just listening to it back a little bit. The other thing that I was going to say is I think the bass could actually be a little bit louder, because to me, it almost sounds like you're playing with, a string orchestra the size of, let's say like 24 players, and then there's like one bassist. I feel like the balance could be a little bit better, just pumped up a little bit. It just sort of feels like he's sort of on the right by himself. I was just listening to the source file, so I know that it's a sort of an accurate reflection. I just think that could be pushed up just a little bit.
Well, it's accurate because you're right. It's chamber strings, and in chamber strings there is only one bass.
Yeah, well, I guess, but with the volume of the solo cello, and that sort of passionate playing, I think that you could definitely bump up the bass a little bit more. It just sort of felt unbalanced in that sense, or by default, it made his part, at least to me, his or her, its part feel less important to me, at least. I couldn't actually hear it when we were playing it over the Zoom call, so I just listened to it, from the Dropbox, and I think it could be just bumped up ever so slightly, or pushed a little bit closer towards the center and not be so far right. One of those two.
Well, I wonder how I've actually panned it then.
More moderate.
I'd have thought I'd have centered it, but maybe I've not. Maybe that's
I don't
part of a problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to say the thing that stood out to me the most was the build section, because everything else I thought sounded fantastic, with the exception of the saxophone, obviously. But
you're so right.
When I first heard it, I listened to it earlier this afternoon. I was like, has Sam accidentally left something unmuted that isn't supposed to be in there or something? But anyway, yes.
Just to clarify, by the way, I wrote that in lockdown and didn't have my saxophone. Otherwise, I might have actually bothered to demo with it.
No, I totally understand. You're like,
sample.
it's just a placeholder. I totally get it. I'm not calling you out or anything.
Yeah.
I was just thinking the build. For me, the cello peaks too soon in terms of its intensity, and I think it's doing that in three ways. It's doing that obviously with the vibrato, and I know that's difficult to do. It's doing it with the dynamics, and I think it's also doing it with the note choices. Because it's like, I don't know, it sounds like it's like reasonably high on the A string, so you're getting like that high, that strong, vibrant sound. And then it feels like you sort of have nowhere to go with your cello. Like it just keeps getting higher and higher, and then it goes lower, and then it gets higher again. But it's always kind of like at the same rhythm. It's not growing in intensity really from about 3 notes in until the end. Like it maybe is a little bit, but it certainly doesn't feel like it. And I think that's one area you could work on to really make the build. Well, if it's approved already, fine. But in general, that is the part to me that I think you could really grow more. Because that's carrying your attention, that's carrying you, but it's not delivering on growing. Everyone else has to do the growing because the cello isn't growing.
I've got a feeling that I know exactly what you mean, and I feared that. But I think I actually turned it up because it's, in terms of sort of, in the original, I think there's more of a gradual build because the scene kind of takes us that way. But at this point, it is literally the end of is literally a curtain call, and you see the curtains go down, and there needed to be a more definite rise. And I think I literally just whacked up the cello solo, which maybe was not the right thing to do.
I mean, would it even be possible to be playing like, semi-breves and then minims and then crotchets and then quavers, and you're feeling, I don't know if that's really appropriate for what you're doing, but I think have more movement elsewhere. So to just be like, I think it's semi-breves the whole way through, it just feels like, come on, get with the program. I
think you were closer with the pitch thing. I think it can definitely start lower. I think because it's not competing with any voice, and I think it was in the previous the copy cue. So, there's no reason it can't start a bit more mellow.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would definitely help. That's a good idea. For sure. Thank you.
Well done.
Cool.
So let's have another final listen to that. And then I think we should have another final watch of our visitor, Eddie.
Right.
Oh, yes.
The stream. So another, idea we've floated too is that in the future Not sure quite when, but we would also love to hear from you guys who are watching and do, an episode where we essentially kind of, do a critique and kind of do this with your music, and, think of it kind of like a 6-person panel masterclass. So I think that would be pretty cool, and and maybe a way that's a little bit more involved, for anyone watching, because it's really, the plan with this kind of format is we want it to be interactive. Cool. So I'll play through it, and then we'll hear from our mascot, and then we'll call it for the evening.
Spider-Man opening.
Very
Long
nice.
fade outs.
Cool. So now
Cool.
Eddie is going to say that we're starting Score Connect in 5 minutes, but we're not. We're ending. We're actually
In
ending.
5 minutes.
We're ending immediately. So thanks everyone for joining us, and hope to see you next week.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Yes. Bye, guys.
Stick around. School Connect will be ready in 5 minutes.